welcome to Gaining Vision with Melanie Taddeo-Nxumalo. I am so excited. As I mentioned to you guys many times before, I am all about hearing other people's stories from across the globe. And today is no different. I have a great guest for you today. But before we get to that, I want to ask you a question. Have you subscribed to the channel yet? If not, take a second, hit subscribe, and please don't forget to like and share. Way back in November 2022, I had the pleasure of attending a City of Brampton resource fair for organizations and services for persons with disabilities, focusing on accessibility. And wandering around that great community center was a tall, dark, and handsome gentleman. He had a story to share, and I had the pleasure of meeting Marc Rainford. And Marc is joining me today to share his story with the world. Marc, thank you so much for joining me.
Melanie, it is a pleasure to reconnect with you, and I'm glad to take part in this today.
Amazing. So Marc, when you shared your story with me at the event, I had goosebumps. We were kindred spirits, so much in common, yet so different. And I would love for you to tell us all about Marc.
Okay, so as Melanie shared with you all, we met at the Abilities Fair, and Melanie's got a really great energy about her. And so it actually started with our stories. We were talking about sort of some lived experience stuff, and we found that we have something in common, which I think is resilience. All right, and resilience for me is pretty much my sort of central focus in life now, is how do you build resilience? And it comes in many forms. So different people have different things that help them build resilience. There are people that with physical challenges that build resilience through the built environment, that they're forced through no fault of their own to have to find ways to build this resilience. And for me, it was mental resilience. So by way of a background, prior to meeting Melanie, I was a police officer with the City of Toronto, the Toronto Police Service, for 15 years, from 2001 to 2016. And during my time in policing, a lot of personal traumas started to happen. And the personal traumas that were going on were impacting my ability to do police work. But I didn't connect the dots. I didn't understand that these traumas were actually taking a physical toll on me. And so as these challenges sort of piled up, I reached a breaking point where I realized like it wasn't sustainable. It wasn't sustainable for me to continue with a really stressful job and continue with all these stresses in life. And so I kind of got to a place where I had to make some choices, and I left policing. And in doing that, I started to see that, this building of resilience isn't necessarily about keeping everything till you hit a breaking point and then seeing what's left and building off of the rubbles of life. Sometimes it's downsizing, to use like home analogies, right? You don't have to build on your land after the hurricane comes through and build off what's left. Sometimes downsizing or relocating is what you do to give yourself a chance to sort of come at things again. And so that's really what it was for me. From that, what ended up happening was so just before leaving policing, I made a decision to disclose to my employer that I was struggling with depression. And at the time, this is now 2016, and at the time that wasn't something that people encouraged. There were a lot of people that were supportive, but they were also supportive of me professionally. And so their position was, hey, like, you have the support you need to get through this, but don't destroy a career because of this. And for me, that was a really critical moment that I felt that a person shouldn't have to be one or the other, that they could be both. And so at that point, I disclosed to my supervisors, hey, I'm dealing with this. I don't want this to be a secret. I need support at work, just like I do outside of work. And they were amazing. So as a result of telling my supervisors, an opportunity came up to speak to senior police leaders across the province of Ontario in Canada. So I went and spoke with all these police leaders, and to my surprise, there were a lot of senior police leaders who had been experiencing similar things throughout their career. And so for them, it was refreshing. They were grateful that I was able to share. And then sort of just through happenstance from there, I got invited to speak to a police service, a local police service. That's now 10 years ago. And ever since, I've been speaking and presenting before police officers now over 50 times, right? And it became this passion because I started to see that police officers are forgotten when we talk about mental health. We put a lot on them to deal with trauma, but we do not necessarily think about them after they have handled our traumas. We're grateful for them. And I think, I don't think there's anybody out there that would say we're not grateful for the work that police officers do, but we just don't think about the after effects of what happens to officers that carry all this. And so that's sort of where I've found a lot of purpose and a lot of passion, right?
I know that, Mark, for me as a citizen, I always think, wow, they're very brave, but you're right. They're dealing with trauma on a regular basis. And if they're not processing that trauma and dealing with the emotions that go behind it, I could see how it would build up over and over again. I do have a question based on what you said. First of all, thank you for being brave and for sharing your story with your supervisor, which ultimately led to you doing presentations. What sort of things do you talk to the police officers about?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So, a couple of the sort of key underpinnings that I want to share with your audience is that for those that might not understand depression and how it sort of manifests, I tend to think of it as sort of living in your blind spot, right? Is that you don't see it coming. We see these stressors and we kind of pack them away, and we kind of we don't give them priority because we have other things in life, right? We deal with it, right? But what happens is they sit there, they don't go anywhere, they just sit. And so the analogy that I use with the police officers is, if you picture your mind as a backpack and the traumas in life as rocks, what happens is the bigger the trauma, the bigger the rock, and these rocks are going into your backpack, right? And so it's not a question of mental strength, which is one of the things that I think contributes to the stigma, is that we talk to people about mental health with this notion that those who suffer are weak, mentally weak, or they don't have some sort of fortitude that somebody else might have. And I think that when we do that, what we're doing is we're shutting people down, and we're saying to somebody, if you come forward, you might be courageous to come forward to get help, but we're also saying at the same time, the reason why you need help is because you're weak, and nobody's going to want to trade help if help comes at the cost of being labeled as weak. Most people will say, well, I'm going to show you, I'm not going to come forward. Hey, that makes me a little bit stronger than the person that does. So the analogy with the backpack works because you can be strong enough to carry the backpack. You can put it on your shoulders, and you can have, whatever amount of strength that you perceive that is capable. You can also be in a wheelchair and carry the backpack. But if you keep putting traumas in, it has nothing to do with your physical strength, or if you're in a wheelchair that can support you to carry a backpack, the backpack itself will break. And so even if you then say, well, let's build a stronger backpack, well, then the backpack will run out of capacity. There's only so much it can handle, right? So one of the messages for me is that let's put aside the strength weakness descriptors, and let's just say, hey, there's only so much capacity for trauma. And if you have too much trauma undealt with, it's going to either break your backpack or it's going to fall out and other people are tripping over your traumas, right? So I think, that could be addiction. That could be a rock that falls out your backpack. You haven't dealt with it. So now you're addicted to something that impacts the people that you love. So they are now suffering from traumas that you haven't dealt with. Right. And so it starts to sort of impact not just yourself, but the people you love. Right. So the message really is, what do you do? How do you handle this trauma? And in the first responder world, it's unique because they don't get to shut it off. They don't get to turn off that tap. They, in the sad, tragic moments that we're in right now, 2 Edmonton police officers were shot and killed. Those officers that work with those 2 deceased officers still go to work, right? So we need the mechanisms now to help them with these big boulders that went in their backpack. How do we support that? And so it's this notion of helping people take stock of the rocks in their backpack. Which ones can't you move and which ones can you move? So the analogy I use all the time is my daughter, as much as I love her, kids can be stressful. That's a rock that goes in the backpack. You love them, but you can also have your child have a sleepover at a friend's house or a family. So the rock is out of your backpack, maybe for a day or for a weekend, so you can deal with other rocks, right? So there are ways that we can take rocks out temporarily. Some we might have to move completely. Here's my little pebble. So there are ways for us to take stock of all these rocks that we have. We don't have to say they must all go back in the backpack. Some of them we can put on the side. Some of them come back to us, but maybe they're chiseled down because they're smaller. People helped us with it. And it's okay for people to live with trauma. We just have to manage it. Right? We can't expect people to get rid of it altogether. So then we have to figure out, okay, how do we manage it? How do we shrink them? Which ones go in the backpack first and which ones never return? Right?
I love that analogy because it really makes you think about it, because I was feeling the backpack and then the rocks, and it was an awesome analogy. Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So after you started talking to audiences with police officers, did you grow that? Did you do something different as well, as far as talking to other organizations?
Yeah, so I've done some stuff with college students. I've done some with high school students as well, which I think is, my background was working with high school students. But an interesting thing actually happened with my daughter. And what came out was we were interacting maybe 2 summers ago. We're walking through a park and I could see her mood change. And she shifted like right before my eyes from being this really outgoing kid to very withdrawn and closed in. And I noticed something had happened, but I didn't know what. There were no external sort of inputs for me to sort of identify as going, oh, that happened or that, nothing. And so I had a conversation with her. I was trying to figure this out. Kid, what's wrong? And she wouldn't say, but her eyes were filled with tears. And so I said to her, I said, if you don't tell me what's going on, I can't help you. And at the time, it made sense in my head. And then I gave it some thought and I started to sort of recall points where I was in real darkness with depression, where I couldn't explain why I felt the way I felt. It was just there. And I realized maybe that's what's happening to her. And I didn't think of it, right? I just assumed that she knew. So I went back to her and I apologized and said, I'm really sorry because I made this about me. I said, you have to tell me so I can help you. So really, this is now about me helping her and not about her. And I said to her, I said, kid, I made the assumption that you can describe what you're feeling. Can we start over? And she said, sure. And I said, can you describe what you're feeling? So let's back up to the very, very beginning. Can you describe this feeling you're having? And she said, no. So I said to her, let's try a different way to get to where we need to get to. And I said, if your mind was weather, what weather would your mind be? And she paused for a moment and she looked at me and she said, Dad, my weather is earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, and thunderstorms. And I heard that and I thought, okay. I don't know what caused it, but I know what she's feeling. And so it stuck with me because I now had something to work with. I didn't know the details, but what I knew was that she wasn't in a good place. She was in a really bad place. And so from there, what actually happened was I spoke with one of my colleagues who presents with me to the police. And I said, hey, I think we got something new to help people. And I explained it to him. He then spoke to a couple other police officers. He was a police officer at the time. He told them what we were doing and talking using weather to describe our emotional states. And it ended up catching on with some officers, that we had these police officers now who may not have felt safe around other people to talk about what they're feeling, but they could talk to each other. All right. So it created the little bubble. So from there, what ended up happening is we started using it with our families. We started using it with kids. And it has proven now to be this thing where parents and kids are actually able to communicate about their mental health without necessarily feeling the pressure of telling each other specifically what. And sometimes the what is not the important piece. It's the feeling. I feel this. And then we figure out, okay, if you feel this, how do we help you feel something else that might be more positive for you? Once we get a person to a better state of mind, they might be able to resolve the very thing that made them feel that way. They might not need us to solve the thing. They just need us to help them move from one feeling to another so that they themselves can think about it differently. Right. So, we've been using it, mentioning about where we speak, we are seeing opportunities now to not just speak with the actual police officers themselves, but now we're able to speak to their family, right? Because quite often, especially with the sensitivity of policing, police officers sworn to an oath of secrecy, so they don't get to go home and unload all these things to their family. They can't discuss any of it. So imagine the challenge that they face. You've got a loved one coming home from work where most of us would say, hey, honey, how's your day at work? And we hear about Bob that we don't like at the coffee machine, and we hear why Bob's this. And with the police, you hear nothing. So they come home and they say it was a good day or it was a bad day. And that's it. Right. So it creates a barrier for everybody in the family, because now you're left worrying about this person who you can see they're struggling. But that's it. That's all you're going to get. Right. So it's been really good to sort of help officers communicate with their loved ones to say, hey, like today's a thunder and lightning day for me. And people can go, okay, thunder and lightning, we got it. Okay, we have to do things to, try to help the sun break through the clouds. Okay, cool, we got it, right? So it's really good. It also frees people from judgment, right? Because I think once we start to tell people what causes our weather, we are naturally going to have moments where we go, well, what did you think was going to happen when you did that? Right? And so the weather really sort of takes the ability for us to accidentally judge one another and focus on care. Right.
I love this because in Canada, we all talk about the weather, how hot it is, how cold it is. So this is just such a beautiful topic, because not only now are you able to have a comfortable conversation about the emotions people are feeling, but it's so Canadian.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's safe, right? Like when I think about it, even in a work environment, right? It's safe. Like you can say to a supervisor, I'm feeling cloudy, and it doesn't become some big thing that human rights is coming in and right? You've given your supervisor enough to figure out how do they support you and how do you the rest of your team support you without feeling like you've now let people into your personal life too far. Right. So it's a really good way for us to help each other and still have some space to come back. Because sometimes the other thing with these things is if you tell somebody something that is intimate, they might not be able to get past it. Right. And so they're stuck. Your relationship now is stuck with what you told them, and you have gotten over it and they haven't. Right. And so, it's a really interesting thing in giving people the opportunity to support free of judgment and, being safe. Like you can say, okay, I've told somebody the weather, but I know that they can't go and say, oh, hey, Melanie, you know what Marc told me the other day? Marc told me, oh, he's having troubles with his wife. Right? That can't happen. What I would be able to do is I come to Melanie and say, hey, Melanie, Marc told me that he's feeling cloudy. And Melanie would go, man, guess what? I'm feeling cloudy too. There's no story there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's a good way to help people get past the distractions and stay on support.
And
right?
I love that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Last 3 years, we've all been stuck in the pandemic. We've really been, and mental health has been through the roof, even more so than normal. It also has become more of a common topic to actually talk about, which could be a good thing. But what have you noticed in the work you're doing during this time period? Is there anything that stood out to you?
So I do agree with you. It is talked about more, but I don't think it's gotten any deeper.
No, that very true. Thank you.
Right. So I think it's like it's the parking lot with the puddle. And right after the rain, the puddle is very wide, but it's still as deep as the incline in the parking lot. And it slowly shrinks in width, but it never gets any deeper. And I think that's what we've had. We used to have a very shallow, narrow puddle. Now we have a shallow, wide puddle. So on its surface, it looks like we're doing a lot, but I don't think we've reached a point in saying, oh, we can talk about this. So I think what we've accomplished to this point is that there is no stigma in talking openly about supporting people with mental health. We are all now on board saying, yay, we support people with mental health. We haven't reached a point of being okay working with somebody with mental health, right? We haven't gotten to the place of saying, and much like we haven't with people with various abilities, we haven't gotten to the point of normalizing that the people that are in our work environments are different for a variety of reasons. And really, it's not for us to figure out what responsibilities they should have, right? It's not up to us. A person gets hired, they do their job, and it's for them to and their supervisor to figure out how they best contribute, right? And I think we're not at a point where people say, hey, put their hand up and say, hey, I'm struggling with mental health. Right now, I think we have the knee-jerk reaction of being overcompensating.
Yes.
Right. So we right off the bat go, oh, okay, so listen, we support you. And so we start then figuring out how much work to pare back from a person. Right. And, That was one of the things that I was really grateful for with my supervisors is, in every presentation that I do with policing, one of the first questions people ask is, did they take your gun? It's one of the top, I would say top 3 or 4 questions. And my response is always, no, they didn't. But they didn't because I gave them the opportunity to be a part of my solution. I said, hey, I am on medication. I feel fine right now, but I'm still trying to create my routines with this thing that creeps up. And I will be open with you and tell you when I'm not able to work. I will be open when I tell you that maybe I feel having access to a firearm is a risk. If I think that paranoia, despair reach a critical point that I am contemplating self-harm, I will be honest with you, right? And so because I created that pathway, my supervisors were fine. I eventually did reach a point where I was very uncomfortable having a firearm because I didn't know if I was going to hurt myself. And I said, hey, my boss actually came to me and said, hey, your requalification to have your firearm is coming up. How do you feel? And I said, I don't feel very good. I don't want to be around it. He said, okay, no problem. They didn't then lock me away. They went, okay, you can't have your firearm, which means you can't go and do certain things because they require that. Right. But they worked with it. Right. And I think, that's where I think society needs to get to the next level of allowing people to write their script.
Absolutely.
Right? Much like we do with people when they're thinking about performance management. So every year your boss says, hey, what are your goals for the year? And that is self-directed workplace. They're saying to you, hey, what do you want to try to accomplish? Does it align with the corporate values? And they kind of figure out, okay, you're on track. You want to do certain things. And they're like, how do we help you succeed? And how does that fit in with the rest of the corporate vision? And if those things align, they're like, hey, great, way to go, Melanie. Like, we like where you're trying to go because it will benefit the company. Right?
And yes, and I love the way that your supervisors allowed you to make your own decisions, knowing what you needed, because nobody knew what you needed other than you.
Yeah, and in fairness to them, they made sure that it met the requirements of the service, and also didn't put the public at all in jeopardy. Like they were able to put those all together. But what they didn't do is they didn't leave me feeling like if I was the last priority.
Yes, which is so amazing.
Right? Yeah, they made sure that I always was like, hey, you're equal to all these other things. It might be difficult to do, but we'll keep at it. We're not going to say, okay, you're a risk. You might hurt yourself one day. We have to protect the service, or, we have to protect the public first, then the service, then you, or no, we have to protect the service and the public, then you. That I was never left with that feeling. So I think that, that's where I think we haven't reached a place yet where we are asking people, what do you think you can give in your situation? What can you give? If a company says that's not enough, that's an honest conversation, right? And at least people know. But I think to automatically pare somebody down and make them less whole, because you've decided that you feel that this is what they can contribute, I think is unfair. And the thing is, ironically, even with my bosses, I told them there are times where I actually need to be more challenged to try to help push myself through some darkness sometimes, right? It's not always predictable. Some days you need to shut things down, and some days you need to push through, right? And it's not always going to be the same thing. And so it is hard, right? It's a hard thing to manage, but you have to be allowed to be a co-author with your supervisors, with management. It should be a co-authored thing, right?
Definitely. So Marc, what steps do you think we need to, as a global community, take to go deeper, as you mentioned?
what steps do we need to take? So I will start with, I don't know how this will fit in the grander scheme, but I know it will fit. I just have to give it some thoughts. So before I left policing, one of the things that I spoke to some officers about was policing is a very interesting profession because it's evolved over many decades. And, you know, I can speak about Toronto, Canada. When women entered policing, they entered at equal pay as men, right? Which was uncommon, and a lot of the world still isn't common, right? But to think that, you know, how the union structure was worked, the jobs were different, right? They would restrict certain jobs at the beginning because of lack of open-mindedness and all the historical shortcomings of humanity and society. But, you know, policing evolved to start to realize, oh, we need to hire for diversity, right? We need to hire for language because we have to be able to serve people. These are practical things that need to exist. And so I said to a senior officer, I said, you know, I really hope policing gets to a point where a guy like me is in policing. There's somebody that's in crisis, maybe on a bridge or maybe walking a little too close to traffic, and the public sees that this person is struggling, right? And policing sees me as an asset. So much like they might get over a radio and ask for a French-speaking officer, an Italian-speaking officer, right? I hope one day in policing, they say, do we have any officers on the air that are managing their mental health effectively? We have a crisis call. Now imagine, Melanie, for a second, you're that person in crisis. I show up in a uniform, I introduce myself and I say, how you doing? I hope you're doing okay. I may understand what you're going through because I've been diagnosed with depression and I'm on Cipralex. I've been taking it for 5 years, 20 milligram dose. I've tried other medications. They didn't work for me. I tried this one, it's working. Imagine if that was the response you got.
A connection like that.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think that there is something to be said. Like, I think that one of the things society does a lot now is we do talk about lived experience, but I think it's tokenized too much, right? And they like to hear from you, Melanie, and from me. It's a feel good in the consciousness. Hey, we brought Melanie in. Hey, we brought Marc in. So, hey, you know, good on us, right? And I go, it is great on you. That is no question. That's amazing. But the other thing is that Melanie could be running a department.
Exactly.
Right? You could elevate from bringing her in to speak to your staff once a year or twice a year to maybe having her run a project. Contractor, say, hey, I know you might not want to work for us permanently, but we have a project going. We'd love to have you work here so that we use your actual professional talents, but we also give our staff also a deeper level of what it's like to work with people that they underestimate because they've never had exposure to, right? Because I think you and I both know that no matter how passionate we are about our public engagements, they evaporate.
Absolutely.
Right. And slowly over time, because they don't come in contact with people like us, eventually they lose the feeling they genuinely had because there's not another experience for them to build a stronger neural pathway to going, no, this is the reality, not what I've been told for decades, or right, or the lack of experience, the vacuum of not experience.
And
right?
I love how you're segueing to my next question, Marc. So you know my passion, my focus is diversity and inclusion, looking at it from an accessibility and disability lens, because these are buzzwords. We've been talking about diversity and inclusion for the last 20 years, yet
Yeah.
we're no further ahead.
No.
And so I would love to hear your thoughts on diversity and inclusion from Mark's perspective.
Yes. So I struggle with it. I actually had an interesting discussion with my sister about this stuff, and I struggle with it because I always worry that when we introduce these new teachings, learnings, what professional development, that people, they use it as a shield, right? It becomes a shield that if there is a problem, that's when they go, oh, but no, I remember I took the DEI workshop, so I'm good, right? It's good, and it's like CPR. It's good for 2 years, right? And it's not CPR, right? So I think that there's two things I think with the DEI component. One of the things that I always have concern with is, so in the case of myself being racialized, you know, I would prefer the opportunity to talk to not just European descendant people about how to engage me, right? As a example, like, so they're like, hey, we met this guy, Mark, and he taught me a bunch of things. Hey, we're good now, right? For me, one of the things I find DI lacks, and it's only, again, my limited experience of seeing things, and it might be out there, is I'm a huge proponent of allyship.
Yes.
Right. And I feel like some of the things that I see with DEI end up causing people to feel like they own historical things, that they're like, it wasn't me. Right. And so there's this but then the other side's like, well, you know what? It wasn't me either, but I'm still victim of it. Right. So we currently have like two sides that are locked in the problems of the past, and both sides are looking for something to help move past, right? And so around the George Floyd time, actually, my sister, she works for McDonald's.
Okay.
And they brought me in to talk about race relations as it related to the police violence and things like that. They were really passionate about it, and they really didn't know how to navigate this. And they were interested in doing something. They're like, hey, we want to do something, but we just don't know where to get into this without, we want to make sure we don't insult people and things like that. And so one of the things I shared with them, and I mean, could be debated about forever, and I get it, is that one of the things I shared with them is that I feel like when we talk about race relations, it's one of the few areas that we don't allow it to evolve. We have it stuck in some paradigm of like, it has been what it always has been, right? And so the analogy I use for the McDonald's crowd was, I said to them, again, being a former police officer, imagine you're driving on the highway and somebody cuts you off, right? When a person cuts you off, you're terrified because you feel like you're about to be hurt, right? Your car, you can lose control, and you go one of two ways. Some people are super angry, and some people are just relieved that they're okay, right? The people that are angry, they might finally catch up to that car and they road rage themselves through it. The other person in the car could be one of two people. They could simply not care. They intentionally cut you off and they don't give a damn. Or after you yell and scream at them, you see them go, oh, I'm so sorry. I honestly didn't see you there. And you find out they never meant to cut you off. And then you've yelled and screamed at them. And then you feel bad because you realize, I've done that before too. I've accidentally cut somebody off, never meant it, right? And I feel like some of the stuff that we're talking about, we need to recognize that not everybody is coming at this the same way. So when we're trying to educate people on DEI, some people have legitimate blind spots. And if we treat them like if they're the people intentionally cutting us off, we don't have honest conversations. Because as soon as somebody puts their hand up to ask an honest, genuine question, if we pounce all over it, the next person that has the honest, genuine questions is like, man, they treat us all like we're the people that cut people off, right? And so that to me is where, you know, we have to sort of recognize that in this space of diversity, equity, inclusion, we always have to start with, when we educate people on this stuff well, which means a combination of the lived experience on both a person that is maybe been a victim of oppression, but the lived experience of an ally who's also been blamed for being an oppressing person when the whole time they've been trying to help. The combination of those two people, I think you can't do one without the other.
And
right?
I love what you just said, because this is something that people don't seem to understand. There's many pieces to this puzzle.
Yeah.
It's a cookie cutter situation. You don't want one size fits all. Every situation is unique, but thank you for sharing that. It's so important.
Yeah, right. So I think, you know, like I've always sort of maintained this belief that I work on the premise of legacies. We're all going to be a part of a legacy. It's either going to be a good one or it's going to be a bad one, right? So, you know, when I was policing, I understood that there are a lot of people that hate cops and there are a lot of people that love cops. So for the people that love cops, if I'm a jerk, I'm tearing down the legacy of good and starting to make them doubt it. For the people that hate the cops, I'm confirming for them to hate the next cop. So I'm now making the legacy for the next cop even harder to undo what they feel because I keep confirming it, right? And so, you know, like I wish people would understand that, you know, we are no more important than the other person, but at the same time, what we do can either make it easier for the next person or make it much harder, right? And, you know, if we all operated from a mindset of leaving everything better than we got it, we could change things really, really fast.
Yes.
Right. But if we assume we have no impact, we're actually really quite reckless at that point. If we're like, it doesn't matter what we do. Well, you know what? A lot of people before us thought that too. And now we're trying to undo the damage of people that thought their actions didn't really have any impact on the world at large, right?
So Mark, what does a world that is fully inclusive look like to you?
It would be slower. I'll tell you that right now. It would be a lot slower, Melanie, because I think I think that we don't have enough dialogue to make like genuine mistakes even, right? Not even good decisions, right? But we tend to have a notion of speed is what we do. And don't worry, if we just get it started, as we see the mistakes, we correct them. But where I think we forget this is usually when we make decisions quickly, we're listening to the same people we always listen to, right? And those people are usually the people that first showed up. And we know, Melanie, that showing up in it of itself has barriers, right? So the notion of getting people to a table to discuss things, if you were being very inclusive, that's a long process.
It is, yes.
Right? That is an enormous feat because there are people that, by the nature of people getting together, you've got people that are recluse, right? So if we go, oh, they're recluse, let's just continue on. Boom, we've already not been inclusive. We've already said, okay, the effort is too great to bring them in.
Yeah.
Then we go, okay, let's keep going. Well, there's some people that are coming on the bus. Well, we only got a certain amount of time. We'll fill them in later. Okay, so now the bus people are no longer, right? And then we're like, some people aren't comfortable coming to this neighborhood. Well, don't worry about it. We'll post it online. Oh, okay. So now we excluded them. Plus we excluded the people who have no access to the internet. And then before you know it, it's the same people that talk at everything. Right?
Certain perspectives.
Yeah, right. So I think, for me, slower would be the first sign of it. It would, because we are actually saying this is really hard. But if we're going to get the first step right, at least give people the right to refuse. Say, hey, if we could make it so you all show up and people just go, I'm not really interested, right? If we're satisfied we got enough people invited to satisfy our sense of fairness to everybody, I think we would be somewhere, right? Like, I used to work at a nonprofit that does public legal education to high-risk youth. And when we were talking about land acknowledgements, right? My take on it was always like, I don't want something written, because I feel like that just doesn't work. It doesn't allow me to think through thoughts in the moment, potentially about what I learned in between the last time I took part in an event where I was sharing land acknowledgement to now. It negates what I've learned because it's a written script, right? And so what I did was I spoke with some young people before an event, and I said to them, here we are talking about the law. And the law is a living thing that we're always changing. And I said, some of you might go on to be politicians and lawyers. I said, if you end up in these roles, as you're changing law, if the law that you're changing does not include our First Nation people, I said, it's not going to be just. So one of the points I brought up with them is that here we are in Canada, here we are in Toronto, Ontario. The laws that we enforce, we're enforcing on people who didn't ask for our laws. They didn't even ask for them. And yet they're overrepresented in a system they never asked for. There is no bigger injustice than that. Right. And so, so I said to the kids, like, what do you think? Is that a fair justice system? And they're like, no, not at all. And I said, but here we are still making laws. We're making new laws all the time. And I honestly don't know if we ever take a law that is about to be read at any level of government and bring together members of our First Nations community and say, does this represent any of the values of any of your tribes? Because I have a feeling we're pretty certain there isn't one that would meet it. And we don't even do it, right? So here we are in a system that keeps churning out new laws, and it's moving just as it always has, right? And this is why I come back to slowness, right? Is that to change anything is going to be slow because we have so many things to undo.
Yes.
And while we're moving one piece, it's affecting another. And what we keep saying is, well, just do this now, and then we'll work on that later. But we don't, because we feel this one benefited just enough people. We'll get to you, right?
And I think this is why, like, yes, we've been talking about diversity and inclusion for 20 years, but I think what you're saying is exactly it. Because people were trying to do the quick fixes, do this, because it'll benefit this, and then not looking at the big picture and not coming back. So of course, there's still more to do. Yes, I love that. Thank you for bringing that. I think that is, especially, in our day and age here in Canada, that is so vital to talk about, because imagine taking that law and asking for feedback from the First Nations community and getting that feedback and actually taking it to heart and making change.
And making changes. Yeah. right? Like, I would love to see it even just start with one piece of legislation
Mhm.
and just say, so we could start with one that is huge, but it impacts everybody, something like housing,
Mhm.
right? Start with housing, see what happens. See what our First Nations community comes up with as a solution for all people,
Mhm.
right? And you know, it's funny because Melanie, I was working downtown some years ago. It was around the Pan Am Games. And I remember being on City Hall grounds at Toronto, and some First Nations residents were there, and they were fundraising to get, they wanted to get something built on City of Toronto property, and they were fundraising. And I said to one of my coworkers at the time, I was like, this is insane. How is it that we are having our original peoples, they have to go and raise money to put something on City of Toronto property? Like, to me, it was disgusting, right? I was like, this should be a no-brainer for Canada. We should simply say, where do you want to put it? And we go and we say, okay, who's designing it? Who do you want to build it? Tell us who's constructing it, not us, you. Who's designing it? Who's building it? When do they want to start? And we, the taxpayer, say, here you go.
Yeah.
Right? And yet, here's another example of us doing this again to our First Nations people and saying, oh, well, no, because any other person in Toronto would have to raise money and go through the permit and go, right? Are they any other person in Toronto? Right? Like, they're not, right?
And
So yeah, it's sad, right? That we have so many examples of institutions that do a lot of DEI, but they still revert back to policies like they are biblical if you are somebody that believes in the Bible, right?
But
So
when were the policies created, and have they been updated to meet today's standards? And when I mean by standards, I mean by the way things have evolved since they were created. Because
yeah,
even simple as I've seen so many different policies that say he.
yeah, yeah,
No. There's so many
yeah,
new different or options that need to be updated. Or again, the language that we're using, especially when it comes to disability,
yeah.
the disabled, no, individuals with disabilities. Like, again, there's so many things that have to change and evolve,
Oh yeah,
as
yeah.
our belief systems need to as well.
So, and you know, I attribute this again to the blind spot thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know why we're uncomfortable handing somebody a document and saying, listen, I am terrible with language. I am not there yet. Right? I am ready to tell you I am not strong on pronouns. I'm trying, and I am at a 90% fail. But good news, I was at 100% fail before. And before 100% fail, I was in denial. And before denial, I was in rejection. Right? So, right? And I think we need to be honest, right? Like, we need to ask for permission to fail while still trying. Hey, you know, I'm trying.
And that's how we learn and grow.
Yeah, right. And I think, like, we're so quick to, again, to do this judgment thing. We're so quick to punish. And I've never seen us punish our way to better conduct. I've never seen it. Right? I've seen us forgive to better conduct.
Yes.
I've seen us be patient to better conduct. I've never seen us get to better conduct by punishing.
100%.
And yet it's sort of the default that we go to, right?
Yes. So Mark, I could talk to you for hours and hours, but I know you're a busy guy, and I would just love to ask, how can people find you? How can they get in touch to learn more about you, your story, the work that you're doing?
Yes. So I'm on LinkedIn, Marc Rainford. You can also check out do-something.ca. So it's do-something.ca, and that is a website that is about promoting mental resilience in first responders. Yeah, or you can reach me at markrainford01@gmail, Marc with a C.
That's amazing, Mark. And I
Yeah.
encourage everybody to reach out to Mark. You heard today, he's got a plethora of knowledge and passion, and his story is one of resilience. And Mark, it's such a pleasure speaking to you as always. And I know our
Thank you.
conversations will continue.
They
And
will.
until next time, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification button so that you're notified as soon as I upload any new content. And until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.
Thanks, Melanie.
Thanks.